Now, the mid-17th century in England was not a particularly good time to be alive, particularly in this area of the country. You will know the mid-17th century was the time of the English Civil War. And the English Civil War, as you know, was fought between the Royalists and the Parliamentarians. And the big question was, who has the final say? Who has supreme authority in the land? The king said, I do, because God put me here and God has given me that authority. The other side said, no. Parliament have final authority because Parliament represents the people. Just how representative Parliament was in those days is very interesting to research. It's worth a look. But anyway, they said, we represent the people. And they went to war over it. They took arms and fought each other. And you will know, I know many of you, because you know your English history, that in 1645 there was this Battle of Naseby just down the road here. And you can go to the battlefield and see where this all took place. The parliamentary new model army that Oliver Cromwell had put together beat the king's army. Hooray! Or maybe boo, depends on which side you are. In that battle at Naseby, just down the road here, 1,000 of the king's soldiers died and 200 of Oliver Cromwell's soldiers. 1,200 people died in a couple of hours. It was a very short battle, just a couple of hours. Shortly after that, Charles, the king, surrendered and he lost his head in 1649. And that was the start of the English Republic, as you know. But I wonder if you know this. Over the whole period of the Civil War, how many people in the country died? Well, it was around 200,000. Not directly from being killed in battle. Most people died as a result of disease and famine that followed on from the battle. 200,000 people was 4% of the population of England. 4% of the population. That's more than died, I think, in the Second or the First World War. It was a massive event in the history of England. But it didn't end there, because after the king was beheaded, Oliver Cromwell, sorry about this history lesson, I am going somewhere with this, you'll see. Oliver Cromwell then turned his sights on Ireland. And if you are Irish, you can hardly mention the name of Oliver Cromwell, because he did terrible things in Ireland. He believed that the Irish were the enemies of the English. The Irish were Roman Catholics. The king had been a Roman Catholic. They wanted to restore England back to the Church of Rome. They were supporters of the king. They must be put down, got rid of. And Oliver Cromwell was unbelievably brutal in Ireland. Some of you will know that. Some of you will not. Understand this. Oliver Cromwell, as a result of his actions, almost a third of the population of Ireland died. Not only in war, but as a result of famine and disease as a result. 500,000 people. Tragic. Absolutely tragic. What causes such terrible things to happen? 4% of the English population, 30-odd% of the Irish population, and all because of injustice, challenge, arrogance, and pride. One who believed that he was God's anointed man for the job, versus those who believed they had a right to be heard. One, a king who favored the Church of Rome. The other, a group who feared the return of England to the rule of the Church of Rome. In the passage before us today, Judges chapter 12, we see civil war. The civil war in England was devastating. It shaped the rest of the English history. But here we see civil war in Israel. And what are the causes of it? Injustice, challenge, arrogance, and pride. Just the same as we see in English history. Injustice, challenge, arrogance, and pride. Let's remind ourselves a little bit about this man, Jephthah. Look back to chapter 11 and verse 1, and we read about where Jephthah came from. We looked at this last time, but let's remind ourselves. Now, Jephthah, the Gileadite, was a mighty warrior, but he was the son of a prostitute. Gilead was the father of Jephthah, and Gilead's wife also bore him sons. And when his wife's sons grew up, they drove Jephthah out and said to him, "You shall not have an inheritance in our father's house. You're the son of another woman." Then Jephthah fled from his brothers and lived in the land of Tob. And worthless fellows collected around Jephthah and went out with him. Jephthah was an outcast from his family. He was a misfit. He was one who wasn't really wanted. He was a bit of an embarrassment. He had shown himself to be a great warrior, but that was not really enough to stop him being cast out by his family. They threw him out, and he went off and lived in the land of Tob. And probably because he was such a great warrior, he gathered a band of outlaws around him, and he lived as an outlaw in Tob. But when things got tough, his people called him back again. Verse 4 of chapter 11. After a time, the Ammonites made war against Israel. And when the Ammonites made war against Israel, the elders of Gilead went to bring Jephthah from the land of Tob. They wanted to bring him home again because he was such a great warrior. They wanted to beat the Amalekite threat. But not only did they bring him back, they said, Jephthah, if you come back, we'll give you a special honored place in the nation. Verse 11 of chapter 11. Jephthah went with the elders of Gilead, and the people made him head and leader over them. Here's this man who'd been an outcast and an outlaw, is now head, leader, divinely appointed leader of God's people. And as we read on through chapter 11, we see that Jephthah defeats the Ammonite threat, and he wipes out that threat from his people. And then in verse 32 we see that. Jephthah crossed over to the Ammonites to fight against them, and the Lord gave them into his hand. The Lord gave them into his hand. Now, Ammon, just to give you some bearings, Ammon was east of Gilead, which was east of the river Jordan. Ammon was roughly the northern part of where Jordan is today, the kingdom of Jordan. And they were threatening west, Gilead and then Israel. Jephthah defeated these Ammonites, but along the way, he'd made a terrible, rash vow. You will remember this from last time. Look at verse 30. Jephthah made a vow to the Lord, "If you'll give the Ammonites into my hand, then whatever comes out from the doors of my house to meet me when I return in peace from the Ammonites shall be the Lord's, and I will offer it up for a burnt offering." Remember that Jephthah was met by his only daughter. Tragic vow. Appalling consequences. So the situation now is that Jephthah is head, he's the ruler of Israel. He's the ruler of Gilead. He's the head of his people, the Gileadites. Now that's quite a rise, isn't it, from being an illegitimate outcast that nobody wants to being the ruler that everybody wants to know and everybody wants to serve. Jephthah is now God's man in the nation. Jephthah is the focus of unity. He's the one that's holding the whole nation together because they all honor him. Jephthah is the bringer of peace from turmoil, from threat. And Jephthah claims the divine right to be what he is. Now, what kind of a person might we expect Jephthah to be at this point? He can't put his history behind him. He'd been an outcast from a dysfunctional family. He'd become an outlaw. When he was reinstated, he was a great military leader. That's the reason for his reinstatement. He'd won a great military victory. He was even prepared to sacrifice his own daughter in his advancement, in his progress. Now, I think we would expect a man like that to have one or two issues, wouldn't we? He'd certainly need to be sent off to a therapist if he lived today. And maybe he'd need to be locked away while that therapy took place to try and sort him out. He must have been incredibly dysfunctional. And in many ways, that's what we see when we get to chapter 12, the passage before us this morning. Because the first thing we see in chapter 12 is that Jephthah is challenged. He has what he believes to be God-given absolute authority. He's delivered Gilead from the threat of the Ammonites. Jephthah's the man. And yet, chapter 12, verse 1, the men of Ephraim were called to arms, and they crossed to Zaphon and said to Jephthah, "Why did you cross over to fight against the Ammonites and did not call us to go with you? We'll burn your house over you with fire. We're going to get rid of you because you didn't ask us to help you to defeat the Ammonites." Now, the Ephraimites, again, for your geography, you imagine the river Jordan running north to south through the land. Ephraim was to the west of Jordan. Gilead was to the east of Jordan. Ephraim had no borders with the Amalekites. There was no land border between them. They weren't really under any threat. The threat for them was if Gilead were to fall, because then it would be a straight through route. Ephraim would be next. So presumably they were concerned that might happen, that Gilead might fall, that Jephthah might not come up with the goods. But the Ephraimites have form here. They've done this before. They challenged Jephthah here. Why didn't you ask us to help you? They'd done the same to Gideon. Flick back to chapter 8 and verse 1. The men of Ephraim said to Gideon, "What is this that you've done to us? Not to call us when you went to fight against Midian." And they accused him fiercely. See, these Ephraimites, they're good at wanting some of the glory after the battle has been won. They don't want to miss out on the victory. Possibly they're quite happy to miss out on the fighting, but they don't want to miss out on the party afterwards. They want it to look like they played their part and they were right in there and part of what was going on, when in fact they weren't. I wonder how willing they would have been to offer help to Jephthah if Jephthah was losing his battle and he would appeal to them to come and help him to fight off the enemy. And so they threatened the victorious Jephthah in the victorious area of Gilead. And there are certain aspects of this threat that are important for us to see. The first aspect of this threat is this. This threat was personal for Jephthah. His background caused him to take this threat personally to heart. Now, verse 4 of chapter 12 in our translation is a bit cumbersome because it's quite literal the way the words are written. Let me read to you how the New Living Translation, which is a bit of a paraphrase, helps us to understand what they said. The people of Ephraim said, "You men of Gilead are nothing more than fugitives from Ephraim and Manasseh." The implications of the Ephraimites' taunt, says one commentator, are not lost on the man who suffered most of his life with the tag illegitimate son of a prostitute. Can you see what they're doing? You're just fugitives. You're a bunch of illegitimates. You're a bunch of mongrels. Jephthah would have taken that very much to heart. They're trying to get to me. It was a personal threat, but it was also a threat against the whole of Gilead because Jephthah was the head. They'd made him their head. Gilead was a bit of a mixed bag, to be true. In that sense, the Ephraimites were not completely wrong. It was not one of the 12 tribes, Gilead, but it was an area east of the Jordan that took in the tribe of Gad and part of Manasseh, a little bit of Ephraim, all bundled together in the land of Gilead. And it had taken on its own identity. The Ephraimites almost certainly considered themselves superior to these mongrels. They were a pure tribe, the Ephraimites. It didn't sit well with them to be saved from the threat by such a group of mongrels as the Gileadites. One commentator says this: what right then did these mongrels have to wage war for Israel? Ephraim's arrogance and derision were clearly deep-seated. We're special. We're God's people. How dare they claim to fight for us? They're a mongrel lot. It was a threat not only to Jephthah, but for the whole of Gilead. More importantly, it was a threat from within. See, Jephthah had defeated the foreign enemy. They were dealt with. But now came the threat from his own people. Yes, Gilead was a bunch of mongrels, but they were Jewish mongrels. They were just mongrels from different tribes. They were Jewish people. Ephraim was part of Israel. This was a threat of civil war. Having delivered Gilead from the external threat of the Ammonite king, says one commentator, Jephthah must now face this internal threat from one of the tribes of Israel. He's brought safety to the land, and they turn on him. How he must have hated that. They should be grateful to me, not trying to kill me. How dare they treat me like that? How dare they talk to me, God's man, in that way? How dare they threaten me when God has brought me from nothing to this exalted position? How dare they do it? It was a threat to Jephthah, a threat against all of Gilead, a threat from within. But here's another key thing. It was a threat that was godless. God isn't mentioned in this threat. One commentator says this: God's not involved in this battle in any way. He's not mentioned anywhere. This is an intertribal feud that God has hardly sanctioned. This episode is a foretaste of the intertribal war that erupts at the end of Judges. Tragedy. God's been pushed out. Despite God being their deliverer, bringing them peace, they've pushed him out. So Ephraim threats and Jephthah responds. When Ephraim had threatened Gideon, Gideon had responded with diplomacy. Just look back at chapter 8 and verse 2. Gideon said to them, "What have I done now in comparison with you? Is not the gleaning of the grapes of Ephraim better than the grape harvest of Abiezer? God's given into your hands the princes of Midian, Oreb, and Zeb. What have I been able to do in comparison to you?" Then their anger against him subsided. Gideon said to the Ephraimites when they threatened him, "Oh, you've done so much better than I ever did. God blessed you so much more than me." And that talked them down. But Jephthah is not Gideon. Nor is he like Gideon. Jephthah responds in verse 2. Jephthah said to them, "I and my people had a great dispute with the Ammonites, and when I called you, you did not save me from their hand. And when I saw that you would not save me, I took my life in my hand, and I crossed over against the Ammonites. And the Lord gave them into my hand. Why then have you come to me this day to fight against me?" Jephthah is not Gideon. Jephthah says, "Look what I've done. Look at my achievements. How dare you challenge me? Can't you see what I've done? Can't you see what a great leader I am? And you deign to threaten me?" Jephthah takes the threat as far as personally insulting the Ephraimites. It's striking, isn't it? Gideon's diplomacy had said, "God did this. God has done this." Jephthah said, "I have done this. I have saved the land." See, Jephthah was responding in the way he'd learned, in the way he had grown up as a fugitive, as an outlaw. He was knee-jerk reaction. From years as an outcast, years as an outlaw, he wanted to rid himself of his enemies. Verse 4, "Then Jephthah gathered all the men of Gilead and fought with Ephraim. The men of Gilead struck Ephraim because they said, 'You're fugitives of Ephraim, you Gileadites,' in the midst of Ephraim and Manasseh. The people of Ephraim responded, 'You men of Gilead are nothing more than fugitives from Ephraim and Manasseh.' So Jephthah gathered all the men of Gilead and attacked the men of Ephraim and defeated them. A rod of iron. Jephthah was not Gideon. So Jephthah is threatened. He responds, and his response is ruthless. It is ruthless. All Jephthah saw was the threat to what he had achieved. I think the parallels with Oliver Cromwell and his treatment of Ireland are there. His rule must be maintained at any cost. We've got to root these people out. These people were enemies of Israel, even though they were Israelites themselves. And Jephthah wants his victory over Ephraim to be total. He must eliminate the threat completely. For Jephthah, the only good Ephraimite is a dead Ephraimite. And he comes up with a plan to do it. Verse 5. The Gileadites captured the fords of the Jordan. So this is the Jordan River. Ephraim on one side, Gilead on the other. Gilead now captured the area of crossing where the Jordan could be crossed. The fords against the Ephraimites. And when any of the fugitives of Ephraim said, "Let me go over," the men of Gilead said to him, "Are you an Ephraimite?" When he said no, they said to him, "Say Shibboleth." And he said Sibboleth, for he could not pronounce it right. What a strategy. What a strategy. He hatches the most ingenious plan to root out the Ephraimites. One commentator who makes this rather funny quip, he says this: "The high and mighty Ephraimites cannot speak the king's English, and so fail the Shibboleth test. Instead of saying, 'God save the king,' they say, 'God shave the king.'" zap. 42,000 Ephraimites massacred. 42,000. Jephthah meets the Ephraimite challenge with an iron fist of attempted total annihilation. War is never pretty, especially when humans are involved. Civil war is even worse. So let me ask, is Jephthah a good man? Is Jephthah God's man? One commentator says this about Jephthah. Violence is often the way that a spiritually flawed character compensates for his or her sense of inferiority. In this case, Jephthah's sense of inferiority derives from his having been victimized by past rejection. Ironically, Jephthah victimized his daughter and now victimizes a brother tribe in a more violent way than his own victimization at the hands of his half-brothers. Jephthah's just doing what he's learned. He's giving as he had received. Interestingly, there's no mention of peace under Jephthah's rule. Verse 7 just says this: Jephthah judged Israel 6 years, then Jephthah the Gileadite died and was buried in the city of Gilead. No mention of peace. And those who follow Jephthah look even less godly. We read about them, all the children and the donkeys, from verse 8 onwards. Things are going downhill, aren't they? Things are going from bad to worse, and we're about to meet Samson. Wow. But hang on a minute. Is Jephthah a good man? Let me read to you from the book of Hebrews. I'm very grateful for Rachel over there for putting me on this trail, this track. Let me read to you from Hebrews 11, because the writer to the Hebrews talks about heroes of faith. He says this: what more shall I say? Verse 32. For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah. What's Jephthah and Samson doing in that list? Heroes of the faith. Examples of great men of faith. How did they end up there? What's Gideon even doing there? Gideon ended up in idolatry. Samson, as we'll see, was self-righteous and self-opinionated, and certainly not the kind of man you'd want to let your daughters anywhere near. Jephthah? Well, we've seen what he was like. The fact is, if God needed anyone to be perfect before using them, then we'd all be hopelessly lost, wouldn't we? My guess is that if we're honest, we see too much of ourselves in these flawed characters. I don't think any of us have been military leaders. Hopefully none of us have murdered anybody or tried to wipe any generation out. But we see into our own hearts, don't we? Too many of us see too much of ourselves in these judges. God knows our hearts. No one of us is what we should be or what we could be. Thank God that he's merciful and gracious. Because if he wasn't, we'd be lost. God can use even me and even you for his glory. Not because we're perfect, but because he's gracious and merciful. Let's bow our heads to pray.